In this video, we're going to look at big idea number one, which is evolution. And you can't really understand evolution until you consider natural selection, and we have to understand natural selection. We have to look at Charles Darwin and how he put together this idea of natural selection, the means by which evolution occurs. So this is the paper he published. He published it in 1859 on the origin of a species, where he put forth his ideas. Okay, and as you can see today, Darwin's still kind of controversial. A lot of people don't believe in evolution or have problems with evolution. Even at the time he wrote it, towards the end of his life, he was being characterized as this ape, you know, like insulting the fact that we might actually have evolved from some non-human ancestor, some ape-like creature. Although we'll talk about this idea of humans evolving from modern apes is a real misconception about evolution. Okay, just some background. Before Darwin published his paper, so 1859 is right about here where he published, there was other ideas out there. In fact, the first person to pose this idea of evolution was not Darwin, but it was a guy named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and he published in about 1809. He put this idea of evolution occurring, but it was the means by which evolution occurred that he proposed that we consider incorrect. So he's no longer considered the father of evolution. It's now Darwin, because Darwin really got the means, the idea of natural selection. Other people that put papers that influenced Darwin out were Thomas Malthus. He was actually a preacher, and he wrote a paper about populations, and he knew populations grow exponentially. He also knew that there's finite resources and that food and food production for humans could only grow in a linear rate. So he had this idea that exponential growth combined with linear supply and availability of food and resources means overpopulation and starvation and war, and he had a lot of concern about that for humans. And Darwin took his ideas and looked at not humans, but maybe how it affects other populations. So Malthus was an important factor in Darwin's ideas. Culver was a paleontologist. He dug up a lot of fossils, found a lot of species that don't exist today, but that we find fossils of. So this idea of change and that species change existed before Darwin. And then Lyell was sort of a geologist, and he looked at rock, and he looked at metamorphic rock, and the idea that change, there's a lot of change that's occurred in the earth, and the earth is very, very old. The Bible says the earth is about 6,000 years old, but if you go back and look at the rock and the sort of geological record, that would contradict that interpretation. So the idea that the earth is very old and that life has been around a long time, these ideas came from Lyell and Culver and helped contribute to Darwin's theory. A guy named Wallace came up with the idea about the same time as Darwin, sent him a paper, and they co-published together. So actually Wallace kind of got ignored. He was younger, he wasn't as well known. And then interestingly, a guy named Gregor Mendel was a contemporary of Darwin's, published about the same year his work on genetics and pea crosses, right? The pea plant. He was ignored. So Darwin's ideas did not incorporate Mendel's ideas on genetics. Today we have a new sort of modern synthesis where we understand genetics and evolution are really tied together closely, and that evolution is really the selection of genes and gene pools over time. Okay, so here's Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He was French. He published in 1809 this idea of evolution, but the means by which he did not say was natural selection. He said it was acquired characteristics. So an example he gave is giraffes spend their life stretching for food in the leaves. They stretch their necks, and over time they stretch that neck, change their body, acquire a characteristic, and pass that acquired characteristic on to the next generation. So this idea that you could change your body and then pass that on to the next generation was put forth by Lamarck. Today we know that individuals change. The change you do to your body does not get passed on. It's the change, the variation you already have in your genes that get passed on. So Lamarck's idea, while evolution he recognized occurred, the means that he identified was now we realize incorrect. So Darwin traveled around the globe. He spent a lot of time going on the South American coast, basically collecting animals and plants, noticing that a lot of these animals closely resembled species on the west coast of Africa. He sailed around South America out to the Galapagos Islands, where he discovered a lot of things: finch, tortoises, iguanas, a lot of species that kind of helped contribute to his ideas. Also noticing that they looked similar to some of the species on South America, so this idea of change over time, he kind of put that together. Okay, sailed around Australia, Africa, and again, several years. He spent a lot of time on this voyage where he kind of collected all these species and kind of put together his thoughts. One of the best examples that when we think about Darwin's examples of natural selection is the finch, and specifically this is a medium ground finch on the Galapagos Islands, and another finch that lives on an island that's a lot drier. You can see that this finch has a small beak. This one has a big beak. This one lives on an island where there's a lot of fruits and large seeds. You can see there's a fig right there that this guy's probably going to feed on. That larger beak is helping him get food. This guy's on an island where there's more grass. Grass seed is very small and fine, so that beak has helped him flourish. So Darwin found any environment, the organisms, the plants and animals tended to have variations which best suited that particular environment, right? And he basically came up with some observations on his trip that he put together and led to this theory of evolution by means of natural selection. Okay, so let's look at those ideas. The four central ideas: number one, if you look at humans or you look at Asian beetles, you notice that they're not all the same, right? We talked about variation within populations. We talked about standard deviations and variations within everything. So central to this idea of natural selection is there has to be variation within populations, within species. Okay, so two examples are these Asian beetles and, of course, human variation, right? So you go around the globe, you can sort of see differences in different people. Obviously, people that live in areas with stronger sun have more pigment. People that live in areas more far north have less pigment, right? That's one of the main things we identify with. We have race by skin color, but actually that's just one very small component of being a human. Second idea put forth by Darwin was this idea, again, he borrowed from Thomas Malthus, about overpopulation, that species can grow exponentially. They can produce a lot of offspring. They can produce a lot more offspring than can survive and reproduce themselves. What does that mean? That means that some of those individuals are going to survive, others won't, and it probably won't be random. There's probably going to be individuals that have some variations that allow them to survive, right? They can conserve energy or use energy a little more efficiently, or they're a little bit faster so they can catch prey more efficiently. They have some advantage that they can use, and that those advantages allow them to survive, and they pass on those variations, right? So the variations that do allow them to survive we call adaptations. So key to Darwin's idea is that these variations that increase the chance of survival and reproduction are adaptations, and over time they will be passed on and cause change within species. So here is an orchid, and you can see right here there is an insect called an orchid mantis. You can see the body and the legs are right here. Okay, and this orchid mantis is perfectly adapted to hunt on these pink flowers. So that is an adaptation that is going to increase that individual's chance of surviving. The insects that go to pollinate are not going to see him. He's going to be able to grab a lot more insects, pollinators, than a mantis that is blue or green or purple, right? So in this case, that pink coloration is an adaptation. Okay, and again, we call that camouflage, a good example of adaptation. So he puts these ideas together and he says, okay, we have these variations that increase your chance of survival. They get passed on. Over time, this will cause descent with modification, right? So nature is selecting for certain variations to be passed on. And what we see, again in the fossil record, is that change occurs, okay? And one misconception a lot of people have about evolution is, a lot of people say, okay, we have the mammoths and they evolved into that and they evolved into that, and they see this sort of linear progression. That's a misunderstanding. What we would say is a mammoth has a common ancestor with modern elephants, right? that is more recent than some of these other species that are less closely related. So for humans, humans did not evolve from chimps, chimps did not evolve from humans, but humans and chimps share a common ancestor relatively recently. So that's kind of a better way to explain evolution in terms of how far back did they share a common ancestor. And again, the closer that break and that speciation, the more genes and the more physical characteristics two species will have in common. So this is sort of an introduction to Darwin and Darwin's theory of natural selection, and it's key to understanding evolution. And that's it.